It was a dreary evening in Silverbrook, the kind where the rain blurred the lines of the familiar streets and cast the small town in a dim, muted haze. The wind carried a sharp chill, biting through the threadbare coat Emma Carter wore as she hurried home from her late shift at Dinah's Diner. Her sneakers slapped against the wet pavement, splashing cold water onto her already soaked jeans. She clutched her bag tightly, the day's tips jingling faintly, a meager sum that would barely dent her mounting bills. But Emma was used to the weight of struggle. At 29, she had weathered far more than many in this sleepy town. As she turned onto Maple Avenue, her mind wandered to her nursing classes, which she attended 3 nights a week after work. She'd always dreamed of becoming a nurse, but dreams felt like luxuries when survival demanded every ounce of her strength. She barely noticed the figure lying on the sidewalk until she was almost upon it. At first, she thought it was a pile of trash, discarded and drenched by the relentless rain, but as she drew closer, her breath hitched. A man, motionless and pale, sprawled across the ground, his expensive suit drenched and clinging to his body. His face was faintly illuminated by the flickering glow of a nearby street lamp. "Sir?" Emma's voice wavered as she knelt beside him, her heart pounding against her ribs. She reached out, shaking his shoulder gently. He didn't respond. Panic surged in her chest, but years of taking care of her mother during her long illness had given Emma a practical instinct in emergencies. She checked his pulse, faint but there, and tilted his head back, assessing his airway. The man wasn't breathing. "Oh, God," she whispered, her voice trembling as she placed her hands on his chest and began compressions. The rain lashed at her face, soaking her hair and trickling down her neck, but she didn't falter. "Stay with me," she muttered under her breath, her hands pressing rhythmically. The street lamp buzzed and flickered, casting eerie shadows over the scene. Her mind raced as she worked, the sound of her own breathing loud in her ears. Where had he come from? How long had he been lying here? Silverbrook wasn't the kind of place where people collapsed unnoticed, but the storm had driven most indoors. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the man gasped sharply, his body convulsing. Emma leaned back, relief washing over her. "You're okay," she said, though he clearly wasn't. His eyes fluttered open briefly, revealing a striking shade of grey before they closed again. His breath was shallow, but at least he was alive. The wail of approaching sirens broke through the rain's relentless patter, and Emma exhaled shakily. She hadn't even realized someone had called for help. Moments later, paramedics spilled out of an ambulance, their practiced movements taking over as they assessed the man's condition and loaded him onto a stretcher. "Do you know him?" one of them asked, a young woman with a kind face and a no-nonsense tone. Emma shook her head, brushing a wet strand of hair from her face. "No, I just found him here." "You saved his life," the paramedic said, her voice tinged with admiration. But Emma only nodded numbly, stepping back as the medics closed the ambulance doors and sped off into the night, their red and blue lights reflecting off the rain-slicked streets. She stood there for a moment, shivering as the adrenaline began to fade. The town was quiet again, save for the steady rhythm of the rain. A sense of unreality hung over her. Who was he, and what had happened to him? Emma glanced down at her trembling hands, still red and raw from the CPR. She had done what she could. As she turned to head home, she whispered to herself, "Just doing my duty," though the words rang hollow. Something about the man, his aura of wealth, his vulnerability in that moment, left an unease she couldn't quite shake. She didn't know that her life and his had just changed forever. The rain had eased by the time Emma reached her small apartment on the edge of Silverbrook, though her clothes were still plastered to her skin. She set her bag on the worn kitchen counter, the familiar scent of damp wood filling the tiny space. The dim light above the sink buzzed faintly, casting long shadows over the peeling linoleum floor. Emma peeled off her soaked jacket and hung it over the back of a chair, her thoughts still circling the man she had found lying unconscious on the street. It wasn't like her to linger on strangers. Life had taught her to keep her head down and focus on her own battles. But the image of his face, pale and stark under the flickering street lamp, refused to leave her mind. Who was he? What had brought him to Silverbrook, a town so ordinary it rarely welcomed anyone from beyond its quiet borders? Her fingers traced the edge of the cracked countertop as she leaned against it, staring out the window at the now drizzling rain. In the distance, the faint glow of the diner's neon sign flickered like a weak heartbeat. Emma had grown up here, in this very town, surrounded by its quiet streets and modest homes. It was all she had ever known. Her late mother, Sarah, had often called Silverbrook a safe haven, though Emma couldn't remember a time when life had ever felt truly safe. Sarah had worked herself to exhaustion, trying to keep a roof over their heads after Emma's father left when she was only 7 years old. The memories of her mother's final years, frail and bedridden, her once strong voice reduced to faint whispers, clung to Emma like a shadow. It was the medical bills from those years that still weighed heavily on Emma's shoulders. She worked double shifts at the diner, juggling trays of coffee and greasy plates with the kind of efficiency born from necessity, not choice. When the sun went down, she transformed into a student, poring over textbooks and medical diagrams at the town library, dreaming of the day she could wear scrubs and help others in a way she couldn't help her own mother. "Maybe someday," she murmured to herself, the words hollow yet familiar. They were the same ones she had whispered countless times in the dead of night, willing herself to believe that brighter days were ahead. The shrill ring of her phone snapped her out of her thoughts. She reached for it, her hands still trembling faintly from the night's adrenaline. The name Lily flashed on the screen, and Emma allowed herself a small smile before answering. "Hey, Em," came Lily's bright voice on the other end. "You okay? You sounded weird when you texted earlier." Emma hesitated. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just had a strange night." "Strange how?" Lily pressed. "Did old Mr. Hargrove finally propose after his 10th cup of coffee?" Despite herself, Emma laughed softly. "No, nothing like that. I found someone on the street." He wasn't breathing. There was a pause, and Emma could picture Lily's wide eyes as she processed the words. "Wait, what? Are you serious? What happened?" Emma recounted the night's events, her voice steady but low, as if speaking too loudly might shatter the fragile thread of her own composure. She told Lily about the man's lifeless body, the rain soaking through his expensive suit, the desperate CPR she had performed until the paramedics arrived. "Wow," Lily breathed when Emma finished. "That's intense. Do you know who he was?" "No idea," Emma admitted. "But he looked like he didn't belong here. Not in a place like Silverbrook." "Well, you're a hero, Em. You saved his life. Maybe he's some rich guy who'll shower you with diamonds as a thank you." Emma rolled her eyes, though a flicker of curiosity tugged at her. The man's suit had been finely tailored, his watch gleaming even under the dim streetlight. He didn't seem like someone who would have any reason to be in Silverbrook, let alone lying unconscious on its rain-soaked streets. "Sure," Emma said dryly, "and maybe I'll wake up tomorrow with a winning lottery ticket under my pillow." Lily laughed. "You never know." Stranger things have happened. They chatted a while longer, their conversation drifting to lighter topics, the latest drama at the diner, the upcoming charity bake sale at the community center, until Emma felt her eyelids growing heavy. She bid Lily good night and hung up, her small apartment falling silent once more. Climbing into bed, Emma pulled the thin quilt up to her chin, the distant hum of passing cars lulling her into a restless sleep. Yet even as her body surrendered to exhaustion, her mind refused to let go of the night's events, The man's face, ghostly pale and marked by a fleeting expression of pain, lingered in the corners of her dreams. Unbeknownst to her, across town in Silverbrook's small hospital, the man lay in a sterile room, monitors beeping steadily around him. The nurses whispered about his sudden arrival, his expensive clothes, and the mystery surrounding his identity. One of them tucked a blanket around his still form, unaware that his waking thoughts, when they came, would begin a search for the woman who had saved his life. In the stark quiet of a hospital room, James Caldwell stirred, his consciousness clawing its way through a fog, thick with fragmented images. The rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor tethered him to reality, its steady cadence a sharp contrast to the disarray within his mind. His body ached, every muscle heavy with the effort of waking. The faint scent of antiseptic tickled his senses, and he opened his eyes to the harsh glow of fluorescent lights overhead. "Mr. Caldwell," a calm voice broke through his haze. A nurse, middle-aged with warm eyes and a professional demeanor, stepped closer, her clipboard in hand. "Can you hear me?" James's throat was dry, his voice a rasp. "Yes. Where am I?" "You're at Silverbrook General Hospital." "You were brought in unconscious last night," she explained, her tone kind but matter-of-fact. "You had a cardiac episode, but someone performed CPR and saved your life before the paramedics arrived." A frown creased his forehead. His memories were a jigsaw puzzle, the pieces scattered and mismatched. He struggled to remember anything beyond the cold rain and the sensation of air forcing its way back into his lungs. Flashes of a woman's face surfaced, a silhouette framed by the glow of a street lamp, her hands steady, her voice urging him to hold on. But the details were slippery, retreating just as he tried to grasp them. "Who?" His voice cracked, and he winced at the rawness in his throat. "Who saved me?" The nurse shook her head. "We don't know. She left before we arrived, but from what we've gathered, she may have saved your life. You're very lucky." Lucky. The word felt hollow as James shifted in the hospital bed, his limbs leaden and his head heavy. He blinked at the unfamiliar surroundings, the white walls and sterile atmosphere far removed from the luxury he was accustomed to. Even in his disoriented state, he knew this place was unlike the private hospitals he frequented in New York or Los Angeles. It was smaller, humbler, a place for those who had few options. As the nurse adjusted the IV line in his arm, James tried to piece together the fragments of his memory. The last clear thought he could recall was driving into Silverbrook for a meeting, something about a land deal. After that, everything dissolved into a blur of rain, cold, and a persistent sense of urgency. His thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of a man in a tailored suit, his polished shoes incongruous against the hospital's worn linoleum floors. The man's sharp features and impeccably styled hair marked him as someone used to command and efficiency. He approached the bed with measured steps, his expression a mix of concern and relief. "James," he said, his voice firm but edged with tension. "It's good to see you awake. You had us all worried." James squinted, recognition dawning slowly. "Elliot?" "Yes, sir." "I came as soon as I heard." Elliot Price, James's longtime assistant and the gatekeeper of his meticulously controlled life, set a briefcase on the nearby chair and surveyed him critically. "You've had quite the scare. The doctors say it was stress-induced, a cardiac arrest brought on by overwork and exhaustion." James let out a dry laugh, though it lacked humor. "That sounds about right." Elliot hesitated, his professional veneer slipping for a moment. "Do you remember why you were in Silverbrook?" James closed his eyes, his brow furrowing as he tried to dredge up the details. "The land deal," he said slowly. "I was supposed to meet someone about a property." Elliot nodded. "You were here to look into a parcel of land on the outskirts of town, but before the meeting, your car was found parked on the side of the road, and you were well, collapsed a few blocks away. We're still trying to piece together what happened. James's mind snagged on the image of the woman again, a fleeting memory of her determination as she fought to keep him alive. The person who saved me. Do we know anything about her? Not yet, Elliot admitted, his tone cautious. But I can make some inquiries. If she's local, someone here will know her. Do it, James said, his voice firm despite his fatigue. I want to find her. Elliot's brow furrowed slightly, but he nodded. Of course. As the nurse returned to check James's vitals, Elliot stepped aside, his phone already in hand as he began making calls. James lay back against the pillows, his thoughts consumed by the mystery of the woman who had saved him. Gratitude mingled with a strange sense of restlessness. He had faced near death before, business risks, personal losses, but this was different. This was a moment he hadn't controlled, a debt he couldn't repay until he knew more. The beeping of the monitor filled the silence as James stared at the ceiling, his mind racing. Somewhere in this quiet town, a stranger had knelt beside him in the rain and given him a second chance. He vowed to find her, not yet understanding how that vow would upend both of their lives. Back in her modest apartment, Emma Carter carried on with her daily routine, though the events of the previous evening lingered in her thoughts. The narrow space, with its mismatched furniture and a second-hand lamp that cast a warm glow over the room, felt like a sanctuary to her. She sat at her small table, a worn nursing textbook open in front of her, and tried to focus on the diagrams of human anatomy. But the memory of the unconscious man kept intruding, his pale face and faint pulse etched into her mind like a lingering question. Emma had shared the story with Lily over the phone, but now, with the quiet of the apartment pressing in around her, the weight of it seemed heavier. What kind of man wore a suit that expensive, yet ended up collapsed in the rain in a place like Silverbrook? The thought nagged at her as she sipped a cup of tea, her favorite mug warming her hands. Life in Silverbrook was rarely dramatic, and Emma had spent most of her life keeping her head down, content to go unnoticed. But now, a seed of curiosity had been planted, one she couldn't quite ignore. Her shift at the diner later that day passed without much incident, though the regulars noticed her slight distraction. Old Mr. Hargrove, who came in every evening for his slice of apple pie, squinted at her from behind his thick glasses. "You're quieter than usual today, Emma," he remarked as she poured him a coffee refill. "Something on your mind?" Emma smiled politely. "Just a long night, Mr. Hargrove. Nothing a good night's sleep won't fix." He nodded sagely, though she could feel his watchful eyes on her as she moved to the next table. The town's residents were a close-knit bunch, their lives intertwined by years of shared history. It was comforting in some ways, but stifling in others, a constant reminder that secrets rarely stayed buried for long in Silverbrook. After her shift, Emma headed to the library for her usual evening of studying. The old building, with its creaking floors and rows of bookshelves, had been her refuge since she was a child. As she settled into her favorite corner, she thought again of the man she had saved. Maybe Lily was right, she mused with a faint smile. He might indeed turn out to be some kind of millionaire. Not that it mattered. Emma wasn't the type to expect gratitude, let alone anything more. "Emma, there you are!" Lily's voice interrupted her thoughts. Emma looked up to see her best friend weaving through the shelves, her fiery red hair and lively expression standing out against the muted tones of the library. "Shh," Emma teased, gesturing to the quiet zone sign nearby. "What are you doing here?" Lily plopped into the chair across from her, her eyes sparkling with mischief. "I came to see you, obviously. I couldn't stop thinking about that mystery man of yours. You've got to admit, it's exciting. A millionaire in Silverbrook. Who'd have thought?" Emma shook her head, a wry smile tugging at her lips. "You're jumping to conclusions." "He could be anyone." "Please," Lily scoffed, leaning closer. "Normal people don't collapse in designer suits. I'm telling you, he's someone important. Maybe a businessman or a politician. Who knows? You might have saved someone famous." "Even if I did," Emma said, closing her textbook, "it doesn't change anything. He's gone, and I'm back to studying for exams and working double shifts. End of story." But Lily wasn't so easily deterred. "You're too modest, Em. You did something incredible. People are going to talk when they find out." Emma frowned, her brow furrowing slightly. "I hope not. I don't want attention, Lily. I just want to get through my classes and—" She stopped short, the words feeling heavy even as she spoke them. "And what?" The question lingered in the air, unspoken but persistent. Lily tilted her head, her playful smile softening. "You deserve more than this, you know. You've always been the one taking care of everyone else. Maybe it's time someone took care of you for a change." Emma opened her mouth to respond, but found herself at a loss for words. She loved Lily for her optimism, even if it sometimes clashed with her own practicality. But deep down, a small part of her wanted to believe her friend was right. That maybe, just maybe, there was something more waiting for her beyond the borders of Silverbrook. As they left the library together, the evening air was crisp and the sky above was dotted with stars. Emma looked up, her breath forming small clouds in the chill. "Thanks for stopping by," she said, her voice softer now. "I needed the distraction." Lily grinned, looping her arm through Emma's. "Anytime. And hey, if you ever find out who he is, you'd better tell me first. I need all the juicy details." Emma laughed, shaking her head. "Don't hold your breath." They parted ways at the corner of Maple Avenue, and Emma walked the rest of the way home alone. The quiet streets felt different tonight, as if the town itself was holding its breath. She pushed the thought aside, focusing instead on the stack of bills waiting on her kitchen counter and the exam she needed to prepare for. Life went on, as it always did. Still, as she climbed into bed, the memory of the man's face flickered in her mind, a puzzle piece that refused to fit. Somewhere out there, he was recovering, and Emma told herself that was enough. Yet she couldn't shake the feeling that their paths weren't quite done crossing. It was late afternoon when Emma returned home from another long shift at the diner. The autumn air had grown cooler, and the trees along Maple Avenue were beginning to shed their fiery red and orange leaves, blanketing the sidewalks in a carpet of color. Emma carried her books and purse in one arm and juggled a small bag of groceries in the other. She felt the weight of her routine, the endless loop of work, study, and sleep, pressing down on her shoulders more heavily than usual. As she reached her apartment, the mailbox on the ground floor caught her eye. She didn't check it often, knowing it rarely held anything but bills and junk flyers. Still, she paused, balancing her bags as she pulled open the small metal door. Inside, amid the usual advertisements and envelopes with bold, demanding print, was a heavy, cream-colored envelope. Her name was scrawled across the front in elegant script. Emma frowned, setting down her bags to examine the envelope more closely. There was no return address, just her name and address, written with precision. The paper felt expensive under her fingertips, unlike anything she was used to. A sense of unease prickled at her as she carefully opened it, revealing a neatly folded letter and an official-looking document tucked inside. Her eyes scanned the letter, the words sinking in slowly, their meaning striking like a cold gust of wind. The letterhead bore the name of a prominent law firm in New York City. It informed her that she was being summoned to court in connection with an incident involving James Caldwell. Emma's hands trembled slightly as she read on, learning that James Caldwell, was the name of the man she had saved. The letter stated he was a real estate developer, one of the wealthiest in the country, in fact, and that there was an ongoing legal dispute surrounding the circumstances of his accident. Emma sank onto the bottom step of the staircase, the letter clutched in her hand. For a moment, the world seemed to blur around her. She had thought little about the man after that night, believing she would never hear of him again. Now, not only did she know his name, but she was also being dragged into something far larger than she could have imagined. As she reread the letter, her mind raced with questions. Why was she being called to court? She had no involvement in the man's affairs beyond saving his life. And what could someone like James Caldwell, a man with unimaginable wealth and influence, possibly want from her? Her phone buzzed in her purse, startling her from her thoughts. She retrieved it with fumbling hands, seeing Lily's name flash on the screen. Taking a deep breath, she answered. "Hey, Em, you won't believe this," Lily began, her voice bright and excitable as always, but she stopped abruptly. "What's wrong? You sound off." Emma hesitated, clutching the letter tightly. "I just got some strange news. Remember the man I told you about, the one I saved?" "Of course," Lily said, her tone immediately serious. "What happened? Did you hear from him?" "Not exactly," Emma replied, glancing around the dim hallway as if someone might be listening. "I got a letter from a lawyer. Apparently, he's some big-shot millionaire named James Caldwell, and now I'm being called to court because of his accident." There was a beat of silence on the line before Lily burst out, Wait. You're telling me that the guy you saved is a millionaire, like an actual millionaire?" "That's what the letter says," Emma said, her voice tinged with disbelief. "But I don't understand why I'm involved in any of this. All I did was help him." "Well, that explains the fancy suit," Lily said, though her usual humor was tempered by concern. "What are you going to do?" Emma let out a long sigh, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. "I don't know. I guess I'll have to go. It's not like I can just ignore a court summons." "Do you want me to come with you?" Lily offered. "You don't have to face this alone." Emma smiled faintly, touched by her friend's support. "Thanks, but I think I'll be okay. I just need to figure out what this is all about." They spoke a little longer before Emma ended the call, promising to keep Lily updated. As she climbed the stairs to her apartment, the letter tucked under her arm, a mix of dread and curiosity settled over her. The idea of stepping into a courtroom, of facing someone like James Caldwell and whatever chaos surrounded him, felt surreal. Her life in Silverbrook was so far removed from his world of skyscrapers and boardrooms that the two seemed like different universes entirely. Inside her apartment, she sat at her small kitchen table, the unopened document from the envelope lying in front of her. After a moment's hesitation, she unfolded it. It was a formal subpoena, summoning her to testify about the events of the night she saved James Caldwell. The date was 2 weeks away, giving her little time to prepare or process what lay ahead. Emma rested her head in her hands, the enormity of it all sinking in. She had only done what any decent person would do, what her mother had always taught her to do, and yet that single act of kindness had pulled her into a world she had no desire to enter. As the evening wore on, Emma tried to focus on her studies, but her mind was restless. She thought of James Caldwell, his life so far removed from her own, and wondered what kind of man he truly was. A millionaire. Yes, but beyond that, he was still a mystery. One thing was certain, her life in Silverbrook was about to change in ways she could never have anticipated. The courtroom had the kind of hushed tension that seemed to amplify every small noise. The shuffle of papers, the creak of leather chairs, and the occasional murmur from the gathered spectators. Emma Carter sat on the edge of the witness bench, her hands clasped tightly in her lap to hide their trembling. The formal setting, with its dark wood paneling and rows of somber faces, was far removed from the humble streets of Silverbrook. She couldn't help but feel as if she had been plucked from her simple life and placed on a stage where she didn't belong. James Caldwell sat across the room, flanked by a team of sharply dressed lawyers. His presence was striking, commanding attention without any overt effort. Though he wore a tailored navy suit, his expression held a subdued intensity, as if he, too, felt the weight of the moment. His eyes rested on Emma with an unspoken recognition, though she avoided meeting his gaze. "Miss Carter," the opposing attorney began, his voice measured and courteous, but with an underlying sharpness. "Could you please recount, in your own words, what you witnessed the night of the incident?" Emma nodded, her throat dry despite the glass of water placed in front of her. She took a deep breath, willing herself to speak clearly. "I was walking home from work. It was late, and it had been raining heavily. That's when I saw him, Mr. Caldwell, on the ground. At first, I thought—" She paused, glancing briefly at James before continuing. "I thought he might have just fallen, but then I realized he wasn't breathing. I called for help and started CPR until the paramedics arrived." Her words were simple and factual, but the memory of that night flooded back in vivid detail. The cold rain soaking her clothes, the desperation as she worked to revive him, and the eerie stillness of the street. It all felt as close as yesterday. "And you had no prior knowledge of who Mr. Caldwell was?" the attorney pressed, his tone polite but probing. "No," Emma replied firmly. "I didn't know him. I still don't, really." From his seat, James shifted slightly, his grey eyes studying her with an intensity she could feel even without looking at him directly. The attorney nodded, seemingly satisfied with her response, and stepped back. For a moment, the air in the room seemed to ease, but it didn't last long. Now it was the turn of James's lead lawyer, a woman with a commanding presence and a voice that carried an air of quiet authority. "Miss Carter," she began, "thank you for your bravery that night. It's no exaggeration to say you saved Mr. Caldwell's life. Were you aware of the risks involved in performing CPR?" Emma blinked, caught off guard by the shift in tone. "I wasn't really thinking about risks," she admitted. "I just knew I had to do something." "I couldn't just leave him there," the lawyer offered a faint smile, one of appreciation rather than triumph. "Your actions were admirable, Miss Carter. Few people would have acted as decisively as you did under those circumstances." Emma shifted uncomfortably under the unexpected praise. She wasn't accustomed to being the center of attention, and the weight of so many eyes on her felt suffocating. But there was no malice in the lawyer's questions, only a genuine acknowledgement of her actions. As the questioning continued, Emma noticed James watching her closely, his expression a mix of gratitude and something she couldn't quite place. When the lawyers finally finished, she was allowed to step down, her legs shaky as she returned to her seat among the modest crowd of observers. The proceedings dragged on, with legal jargon and evidence being presented that Emma barely understood. She learned bits and pieces about the events leading up to James's accident, his business dealings in Silverbrook, the disputes over land ownership, but much of it felt distant, unrelated to her own small role in the story. When the court adjourned for a recess, Emma stood to leave, eager to escape the stifling atmosphere. As she gathered her belongings, she heard a voice behind her, low and measured. "Miss Carter!" She turned, and there he was, James Caldwell, towering slightly above her and radiating an air of quiet authority. Up close, he was even more striking, with silver threads woven into his dark hair and a demeanor that spoke of a life accustomed to control. But there was something else in his expression, something softer that caught her off guard. "Mr. Caldwell, she said, her voice steady despite the sudden flutter in her chest. I hope you're feeling better. I am, thanks to you, he replied, his tone sincere. I owe you more than I can say. Emma waved off the sentiment awkwardly. You don't owe me anything. Anyone would have done the same. I'm not so sure about that, James said, his lips curving into a faint smile. I don't meet many people who act without expecting something in return. The words hung between them, an unspoken acknowledgement of the gulf between their lives. Emma didn't know what to say, so she simply nodded and stepped past him, feeling the weight of his gaze as she walked away. Outside the courthouse, the cool autumn air filled her lungs, a welcome reprieve from the stifling tension inside. But as she made her way back to Silverbrook, she couldn't shake the feeling that her encounter with James Caldwell was only the beginning of something far more complicated than she could have imagined. The following morning, Emma rose early, the events of the previous day still swirling in her mind. The courtroom, the pointed questions, and James Caldwell's intense gaze lingered with her as she made her way to the diner. She wanted nothing more than to slip back into the comfort of her routine, the steady rhythm of serving coffee and chatting with regulars. But as she tied her apron behind her back, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, though she couldn't yet name what it was. By mid-morning, the diner was bustling, the clink of dishes and hum of conversation filling the air. Emma moved quickly between tables, refilling cups and jotting down orders, grateful for the distraction. She had just placed a fresh pot of coffee on the counter when the bell above the door jingled. Turning instinctively, she froze. There, standing in the doorway, was James Caldwell. His tailored coat, dark and unassuming, somehow made him seem even more out of place in the small-town diner. The chatter in the room softened as heads turned to take in the newcomer, his polished presence a stark contrast to the comfortable familiarity of Silverbrook's residence. James scanned the room until his eyes settled on Emma. He offered a small, almost apologetic smile before stepping forward. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice low but warm, "I hope I'm not interrupting." Emma's cheeks flushed, and she quickly set the coffee pot down, wiping her hands on her apron. "Mr. Caldwell," she replied, her voice tinged with surprise, "this is unexpected." "I owe you an apology," he said, his expression earnest. "Yesterday at the courthouse, I didn't get a proper chance to thank you. May I have a moment of your time?" Emma glanced around the diner, acutely aware of the curious stares from the regulars. Old Mr. Hargrove, seated at his usual spot by the window, raised his bushy eyebrows in silent inquiry. Emma forced a polite smile and gestured toward a quieter booth in the corner. As they sat down, James leaned forward slightly, his hands resting on the table. "I know this must be overwhelming for you," he began. "It's not every day someone like me shows up in a place like this." Emma folded her hands in her lap, her eyes steady on his. "You're right, it's not. But I didn't save you for recognition or gratitude, Mr. Caldwell. I just did what I thought was right." "I believe you," James said, his voice soft but resolute, "and that's what makes you remarkable." Emma blinked, taken aback by the sincerity in his tone. She had expected him to be distant or dismissive, perhaps even condescending, but there was none of that in his demeanor. Instead, he seemed genuinely humbled, as if the scales of power and privilege had tilted, if only slightly. "I wanted to thank you properly," he continued, "and to offer you something in return." Emma's brows knitted together, her instincts on alert. "I don't want anything from you, Mr. Caldwell. I'm not looking for a reward." "It's not a reward," James assured her. "It's an opportunity. I run a charitable foundation that supports education and healthcare initiatives. After hearing about your nursing studies, I thought you might be interested in joining our team." We could use someone with your skills and your compassion. Emma's heart skipped a beat. The offer was unexpected, and for a moment, it sounded almost too good to be true. But a lifetime of hard-earned skepticism quickly tempered her initial reaction. She straightened in her seat, her voice measured. "That's very generous of you, but why me? I'm just a waitress from Silverbrook. I'm not exactly qualified to work for someone like you." "You're exactly the kind of person we need," James said, his gaze steady. "Someone who understands what it means to put others first. And from what I've seen, you're far more capable than you give yourself credit for." Emma hesitated, her thoughts racing. The idea of leaving Silverbrook, of stepping into a world she barely understood, was both thrilling and terrifying. Yet there was a part of her, a small, hopeful part, that wanted to believe his words, to trust that she could be more than what her circumstances had allowed. But doubt lingered, sharp and insistent. "I appreciate the offer," she said carefully, "but I need time to think about it." "Of course," James said, his tone understanding. "Take all the time you need. If you decide to accept, my assistant, Elliot, will handle all the details." Emma nodded, her mind still clouded with uncertainty. As James rose to leave, he reached into his coat pocket and placed a small business card on the table. "No pressure," he said with a faint smile, "but I hope you'll consider it." She watched as he left the diner, the door closing softly behind him. The room buzzed back to life, the other patrons resuming their conversations, but Emma felt as if the world had tilted slightly off its axis. She stared at the card in front of her, the elegant lettering spelling out James Caldwell's name and contact information, and felt the weight of his offer pressing down on her. Lily arrived at the diner shortly after, her eyes lighting up as she spotted Emma in the corner booth. "What's that look on your face?" she asked, sliding into the seat across from her. Emma sighed, holding up the card. "James Caldwell just offered me a job." Lily's jaw dropped, and her voice rose in excitement. "You're kidding! That's amazing, Em! What kind of job?" "Something at his foundation," Emma said, her tone guarded. "But I don't know, Lily. It feels complicated." "Complicated?" Lily scoffed. "This is your chance, Emma. You've spent your whole life stuck in this town, taking care of everyone else. Maybe it's time to do something for yourself." Emma looked down at the card again, her fingers tracing the embossed letters. She wanted to believe Lily was right, but deep down, she couldn't shake the fear of stepping into the unknown. The days that followed James Caldwell's unexpected visit to the diner brought more attention than Emma was accustomed to or comfortable with. Word had spread quickly through Silverbrook about the mysterious millionaire and his meeting with the town's unassuming waitress. While some praised Emma for her bravery in saving a stranger's life, others gossiped about what James might truly want from her. Emma, meanwhile, kept her head down, trying to make sense of the choices laid before her. By the end of the week, Lily convinced her to take a break from the constant whispers and judgmental glances. They met at their usual spot by the riverbank, a quiet place where they had spent countless afternoons growing up. The leaves were falling steadily now, a mosaic of orange, yellow, and brown carpeting the ground. Emma watched the gentle ripples in the water, trying to calm the unease that had taken root inside her. "I still can't believe you're hesitating," Lily said, breaking the silence. She tossed a small stone into the river, watching it skip once before sinking. "If I were you, I'd have packed my bags the second he offered." Emma smiled faintly, but her hands were knotted in her lap. "It's not that simple, Lily. What if this isn't the right choice? What if I leave and fail?" "You won't fail," Lily